Welcome. In this video, we're going to go through annotations for lesson plans and other instructional materials. This video has been created to support the curriculum from Webster University's Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages program and curriculum. So first of all, what are annotations? So annotations are a way that a person can make explicit specific decisions that they have made. So in our TESOL program, annotations can be used to make clear and explicit the rationale behind a TESOL student's decision. So here's an example. Imagine a TESOL student submits the following for a task, which is requiring you to prepare a reading task. And so what is submitted is the teacher reads the book, My Food, Your Food, Our Food to students. But if you notice here, it's not clear if the TESOL student misread the instructions or if they believe that this is actually an opportunity for students to engage in reading. So now I want you to imagine that that same TESOL student has annotated what this task is intended to accomplish for students. Our teacher reads the book, My Food, Your Food, Our Food to students, RL. R is for reading, and L is for listening. So now it is clear that the TESOL student intended this to be an activity that was engaging a group of learners in both reading and listening. Yet the students in this particular task in this lesson are not reading. The teacher is the one who is doing the reading. So the teacher reads the book, My Food, Your Food, Our Food to students, again, annotated as reading and listening. So now an instructor can suggest a slight modification to meet the goals of students being engaged in listening and reading. The teacher projects the book, My Food, Your Food, Our Food, onto the television screen and reads to students. The teacher uses her finger to show which word she is on to help students follow as she reads, reading and listening. So now what's happened is through a minor revision, this task has been made more clear. It's very clear that students in the class will be reading, so we have the words on the screen, and they are listening to the book being read to them. So this is now a short task that integrates both reading and listening. So another option we would have for this is the students could each have their own copy of the text and be reading along as they're sitting. So there's not one single way to revise these in order to meet the goals of a teacher. So where do these annotations come from? So what we found in our TESOL program is that many students were already annotating their lesson plans. When we found these annotated lesson plans, it showed a higher level of teacher reflection. It made it easier to assess and to discuss these lesson plans. And it resulted in our teacher candidates, the TESOL students, finding the process of developing lesson plans more rewarding and informative. So the purpose of annotations in our program is to make explicit the thought process and the intentions of TESOL students, which may not be clear otherwise. Annotations invite you to consider a wider range of language instruction methods and approaches. Faculty can also then provide stronger feedback to help you become even stronger as you are preparing materials to work with English learners. So let's get into annotations. Several courses in the TESOL program will require that you use these annotations. TESOL 5139 will ask you to do this for tasks and activity outlines. TESOL 5220 will ask you to do this for language objectives and for lesson planning. And then in your final portfolio for TESOL 5040, the practicum, will also require that you use annotations. There are two types of annotations that we're going to look at. The first type is estimating for the amount of time that you expect different tasks or steps of tasks or activities to take. The second is annotations for language skills, assessment, and accessibility. We'll spend more time on this second type. So imagine that you have a 60-minute class. If you have this 60-minute class, you're probably not going to do one 60-minute activity. You need to select, develop, and order a series or a set of tasks and activities to fill that 60-minute period. When you do this, include estimated times in minutes for the different portions, for sections, for tasks, activities, subtasks within that activity. So here's an example annotation on time. I'm not going to read through this, but what you'll be able to see is that we have different time annotations that are after each of these tasks. And so notice here that the total estimated time is 60 minutes. So what you want to do is after you have your estimated amounts of time, go ahead and total up that amount to make sure that you have enough or that you don't have too much content to fill the amount of time that you have for your instructional period. So when you teach your task or your activity or your lesson, you can use these time annotations to gauge if your tasks take more or less time than predicted. So when I'm teaching, I like to have a printout of my lesson plan. And as I teach and as I give time for my students, I will keep track of time myself. And then I'll go back and I'll make revisions to my lesson plan. So if I thought that students would need 10 minutes to meet in groups and it only took them 7 minutes, then I may shorten that in my lesson plan so that the next time that I teach it, I have an appropriate amount of time. This can help you learn about yourself as an instructor. It can also help you learn about your learners. Sometimes you have learners who are more advanced, who take less time to do activities. Sometimes you have learners who need a bit more time in order to do tasks or activities that you have developed. Also, as a teacher, you may find that you take too much time on certain activities or that you are rushing at times. So predicting these times can greatly help you. Also, your learners may need more or less time for particular steps, tasks, and activities, as I gave as an example when I'm putting students into groups. So other annotations that we're going to focus on, we'll look at integration of language skills, reading, writing, listening, speaking, vocabulary, pronunciation, and focus on form, forms of assessment, formative assessment, and summative assessment, and then ways to include all learners, technology, culturally responsive pedagogy, and differentiation. And we'll take a look at each of these. So when we're using our annotations, it's also helpful to order these annotations, and you'll see multiple examples of this throughout the rest of this presentation. When ordering them, we want to put what we believe is the primary skill first. So if we take a look at an example here, students take notes while listening to the lecture, LW. By annotating it this way, what the teacher is saying is that listening is the primary activity with an integration of writing for the note taking. Here's another example. Students share their previously written responses orally with their shoulder partner, S and L. So here this is a speaking and listening activity. And for this particular one, it could be LS or SL. So here, because it's both speaking and listening, or both listening and speaking, the order is not as important. At other times, the ordering will become a bit more important. And here's a third example. Students type responses into the Padlet using words from the word wall and an action verb. So here we've got F, W, V, and T's. We have 4 annotations all together for this one task. So here we notice that focus on form is intended to be the focus. because we're asking students to use action verbs. And this is done through writing, which is second, while integrating specifically learned vocabulary. Notice how it says from the word wall, and then using technology. And here we're using technology in a purposeful way with using the Padlet. So it's important when annotating for language skills that this is done based on what the learners in the class are doing. So not what the teacher's doing, but what the learners are doing. Here are a few more examples. So example 1, speaking. The teacher talks about air pollution. So this is a listening task for the learners. The teacher asks questions about air pollution and learners respond. So now this is both listening to the teacher and speaking. So this can be S and L. Or the teacher asks questions about air pollution. Students take notes about their answers and then share their answers with a partner. Now this also integrates writing. So we can annotate this as LWS. Here's an example focusing on technology. So the teacher shows a video on the interactive board. So with this, notice that this is not integration of technology because the learners are not engaged in using technology here. If we allowed this to be technology, then any use of PowerPoint or slideshow would be technology. But that's not the point or the purpose here. But if we change this to the teacher directs students to share their reflections on the video using a Padlet, now the students are actively engaged in using technology. So this we could annotate as TW, technology and writing. So the next slides will show a chart with the annotations, followed by example annotations in a lesson plan format. So the chart that will be, or the charts that will be on the following slides are available in Canvas in the classrooms for courses that require the use of annotations. So at the top, we have estimated number of minutes, which we covered. R will be for reading. So this will be for opportunities for learners to read. This can be printed text, digital text, mixed media text, or task-based activities that involve reading as part of them. W is for writing. These are opportunities for learners to write. This can include note-taking, brainstorming, where the brainstorming is writing down ideas, written work, written exercises, and again, task-based activities that involve writing. L is for listening, which is opportunities for learners to listen. This could be listening to the teacher, listening to other learners, to audio input, and also during task-based activities that include listening components. And then S is for speaking, and this is opportunities for learners to speak. This could be speaking to other learners, to the whole class, students speaking to the teacher, students reading aloud, students giving presentations, students doing role plays, and again, task-based activities that require students to speak. So you'll notice here with reading, writing, listening, and speaking, this covers the 4 skills, the 4 basic language skills. There are additional language skills which can also be annotated. V is for vocabulary. So this is focused on vocabulary acquisition. So looking at academic vocabulary, specialized vocabulary, this could be your tier 3 words that you're teaching, high frequency words, language of origin, looking at root words, looking at affixes, or inferring meaning based on context. P is for pronunciation. Now this is going to be when there's a specific focus on pronunciation. So not just because someone's speaking, we always have to work on pronunciation when we're speaking, but if there's not an explicit focus on pronunciation, you should not use the P annotation. But if we're doing choral repetition to focus on pronunciation, if we're working on letter to sound connection, if we're working on specific segmentals, those are specific consonant and vowel sounds, or suprasegmentals, This would include word stress, rhythm, intonation. Then it would be appropriate to annotate for P for pronunciation. Then F is for focus on form. So this is when we're getting into grammar and other linguistic forms. So when we're asking our students to pay attention to verb form, to verb tense, to verb aspect, to modal verbs, to parts of speech, prepositions versus verb particles. So we get verb particles in multi-word verbs, such as to look up. There, the word up is not a preposition, but it is a verb particle, part of a multi-word verb. Word order, collocations, and also discourse markers. Then T is for technology. So this is when we are integrating technology in a meaningful way. So when students are engaged in using computer devices, they may be using mobile devices, visual projectors where the students are engaged in using the visual projectors, interactive boards, and using different audio and video recordings. VR headsets, uh, virtual reality headsets, are another thing that can be used. I've seen teachers take mobile devices and turn them into VR headsets. So that would also be T, integration of technology. Then C is going to be for culture. So when we're looking at culture responsive pedagogy, we're focused on integration of the knowledge of learners' backgrounds or finding ways to allow our learners to express and explore aspects of their own or also of other students' cultures or other people's cultures as an integral part of their instruction. Then D is for differentiation. This is for ways to differentiate instruction for individual tasks, activities, and assessments. So differentiation may include for language level, for exceptionalities, for learning styles, for EL versus non-EL. For the purposes of our program, we really want to focus our differentiation based on language needs. That's one of the primary functions of a TESOL instructor, is being able to differentiate for English language learners, whether that be ELs and non-ELs or English learners at different proficiency levels, different language proficiency levels. Then we have two annotations that are based on assessment. FA is for formative assessment. So these would be formative assessments, which may include comprehension checks, informal assessments, and low-stake assessments or assignments. Then SA is for summative assessments. So summative assessments may include end-of-lesson assessments, end-of-unit assessments, or formal assessments. So let's take a look at annotations in use. So now, the next 4 slides are going to include some examples of sections of lesson plans, and it's going to show the use of these annotations. So as you follow along, it may be good to get a piece of paper and write down which annotations you might use after each of these steps of these tasks and activities. It is important to note, though, that there's not one particular way to annotate these, so there may be more than one way, and I'll talk about some of those options. But also notice that these slides will show some examples of ways that you can organize steps of tasks and activities. We get some questions about getting examples of what lesson plans look like, and so these are some examples to show you. So example 1 is a chain activity. So in the first step, teacher will read a short story from Vietnamese children's favorite stories. So for this first step, this is annotated as L and C. So for the students in the class, this is a listening task, and it's also marked C for culture, with the integration of a story that is from the Vietnamese tradition. So perhaps we have one or more students from Vietnam in the class and we're pulling from their culture, or we're learning about other cultures around the world. Notice that while the teacher is reading, here this is not marked for R for reading because it does not say that the students are reading along. Now, if the teacher is showing the book or if the students have copies and are reading along, then it would also be R reading. But the step in this activity would have to be written differently in order for R to be used for the annotation. Next step, teacher hands out the written instructions for the activity and asks students to take turns reading different steps. So for this, it's annotated R and S. So here the students have instructions that are written down, and so the students are reading, and they are also speaking because they're reading out loud. Now, I have seen some teachers also annotate this as L because the other students are listening while students are reading out loud. Then students will pass what they wrote to a peer to read what was written and then add at least one more sentence to the story. 1 minute per round with 15 rounds total for 15 minutes. So for this is annotated R and W. So this is a reading and writing activity. It could also be WR, writing and reading, but with a chain writing activity. Students have to read what other students have written before they then write themselves. Then we have here, newcomer students will continue to work on the worksheet with sentence frames. This one is annotated for D for differentiation. So if we notice here, all students are engaged in a writing activity, and here a chain writing activity. The majority of students are doing the classic chain writing activity where they're writing and then they're passing it to the next person who reads and then they add to it. But for newcomer students who may not be able to participate at the same level, there is a differentiated task, which is working with sentence frames. So this student is still reading and is still writing. However, it's with a differentiated task. The second example is a group discussion. So for this, the teacher will introduce the concept of national holidays by projecting images of famous celebrations from around the world and asking students to write down the name of each holiday. So this could be Diwali, Carnival, 4th of July. And this one is annotated W, C, and T. So W for writing, because the students in this class are writing down the names of holidays and celebrations. C for culture, because we're looking at different holidays and celebrations from around the world. And then T for technology, because we're purposefully using technology to engage our learners in images from around the world. Then here we have lower level ELs will have a handout with options for holidays and be asked to circle the correct holiday. So as we found in the previous example, this is an example of D for differentiation. So what's different here is in this differentiated task, the English learner is going to be circling, so the English learner is not writing. So I've also seen with annotating for differentiation that teachers have included what the student is doing, so that this would be differentiation along with the C for culture and along with T for technology. Then we get teacher will lead a discussion on other holidays in countries with which they are familiar. So this is annotated for C, S, and L. So C for culture, as the students are engaged in various cultures around the world. S for speaking, because the students will be speaking in the discussion, and L for listening, because they're listening to each other. So a classic classroom discussion will have S and L, L and S. So now example 3, we have a role play activity. So this is role play preparation. So the teacher will review the topic of job interviews, highlighting some key vocabulary. So this is annotated for V for vocabulary. So this is quite clear because we have highlighting some key vocabulary. Now, if there was, I've seen some teachers will annotate this as R for reading. If it explicitly says that the teacher writes the vocabulary on the board and the students are reading the vocabulary, then it would be reading and, so it'd be V and R, vocabulary and reading. If the students are asked to write these in their notebook, then we could also add a W to it. If the students are being asked to say the vocabulary words out loud, then we could add an S to this. And if there's an explicit focus on the pronunciation of these vocabulary words, so especially if they were difficult words to pronounce, then we could add a P to this. They'll be mindful not to have everything where it's written on the board, they're writing it down, they're speaking out loud and focusing on pronunciation. That may be a focus on too many skills in one step. Then, teacher will review question words, inverted structure, and question types, WH questions, and yes/no questions. This one's annotated for F for focus on form. So this is a very classic focus on form. We're looking at this inverted structure that's needed for yes/no questions, understanding different question types. And then we get to the next step. Students will use worksheet 4.2, creating strong interview questions, and convert the statements into questions. So for this step, we have F, FA, and W. F is for focus on form, FA is formative assessment, and W for writing. So again, we're continuing with the focus on form. This is a formative assessment because the teacher can collect these worksheets and get a sense of how well each of the students are doing in terms of understanding the different question types and being able to write questions. Because remember, this is preparation for a role play on job interviews. So being able to write different kinds of questions will be important. And then W for writing because they're obviously writing the questions. Then the last step here, students will read aloud their questions. Teacher will lead choral repetition of sample questions written by students with a focus on intonation, falling intonation for simple WH questions, and rising for yes/no questions in the USA. So this is annotated for S and P. S for speaking, because the students are reading aloud, and then P for pronunciation. Here we have P because there's an explicit focus on the intonation. Now, some teachers have also annotated this for R because they're reading the questions and they're reading them out loud, so including an R there would also be appropriate. Then one final example. This final example you'll notice is in a grid or a table format. This is just another way to organize it. And what you may notice here is in this particular organization, there's an entire column for differentiation. So everything in that column would be annotated for D. So the first task, teacher shows flashcards of preposition words and reviews the pronunciation of each one. This one is annotated for F, focus on form, and P, pronunciation. So I've had this discussion with many TESOL students where they have thought that this would be vocabulary because we have flashcards. So prepositions are function words. So when we are focused on function words, we're actually doing a focus on form here. If we're doing vocabulary, vocabulary is typically going to be our content words. So that's going to be nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So here with focusing on prepositions, we've got to focus on form. And because this explicitly says reviews the pronunciation of each one, we do also annotate for P for pronunciation. The next step, teacher asks students to draw 3 pictures, including a cat and one other object. The cat should be in a different position. The teacher tells students to think about 3 different prepositions when they draw each scene. And here the students should only draw at this point. So for this one, there's actually no annotation. So this is a drawing activity. And this is included here to show you that not every step has to have an annotation. If students are being asked to sit in a circle or to stand in a line, that's moving around, just as here we've got drawing, that's not necessarily one of our annotations. Now, I have had TESOL students ask, well, aren't the students listening? Well, the students are listening, but the question would be, are the students engaged in listening? Is this really a listening task? So telling the instructions, is that specifically a listening task at this particular time? Okay, the next step. Teacher shows each of the students' drawings and asks students to say the correct preposition for the position of the cat. The teacher then models a complete sentence. Yes, the cat is under the table. This is annotated for F and S. So again, we have focus on form here for the prepositions, and then S for speaking. Now, with the teacher modeling the complete sentence, the students would also be listening to the modeling of that. So we could also annotate this for L for listening. Again, that really depends on the instructor in terms of what is the focus here and what's intended. And then finally, the teacher asks each student to label each drawing with the correct preposition, spelling it out. So this would be W for writing because the students are writing, so labeling would be a form of writing. And then F for focus on form because the students are engaged in prepositions here. So do be careful. Don't simply list off several annotations. Be certain that each annotation is relevant to that particular task. So for example, students will talk with their shoulder partner. You wouldn't annotate this as L, S, V, P, and C. With the students talking with their shoulder partner, this would be a listening and speaking task. Now, they may end up using vocabulary, they may end up focusing on pronunciation, there may be cultural topics, but the way that this is written, there's no explicit focus on vocabulary or on pronunciation skills, and there's no explicit focus on culture here. Now, this could be revised in such a way to do that. But again, I'd be mindful not to overload particular steps with too many annotations. There's another video that you should watch that shows the application of these annotations to language objectives. So please watch that video. So using annotations when you write your language objectives can greatly strengthen them. Then please also review resources that are in your Canvas classroom for more ideas to help you out as you're developing tasks, activities, and lesson plans. And thank you very much for watching this video.